This week, the design presentation will cover novelty versus familiarity in web design presence. Design is a careful balance between what is old and what is new. There is a value for novelty and originality in design. Take this tap, for instance, and have a think about all the things that are novel about it. What makes it different from every other tap you've seen? Is it the little joystick control? Perhaps the fact that the tap is open on the top? Or is it the aerodynamic, sleek design? This chair, what makes it different from other chairs? What is truly novel about it? Now, it's made up of a cylinder base with a seat that has a lip on it. Is it the materiality, the metallic base with the bright green seat? Is it the fact that when you look at that metal cylinder that makes up the base, the legs are actually comprising circles that are put together? There are many unique elements to this design that makes it different from other chairs. What about this shoe rack? Now, most shoe racks are made from wood, not metal. They allow the shoes to rest on it. This one has it balancing through the toes. The serpentine shape to it, very different from other shoe racks. So when it comes to novelty, there is a value in newness, surprise, something that people haven't seen before. Novelty attracts attention, especially if that novel item is in a familiar setting. It can be fun to look at new things, and many designers approach novelty in a playful way, doing the unexpected, doing something that is very joyful. However, there is also a value in familiarity and things that you have seen many times before. Take, for instance, this tap. Now, the knob to turn the water on is a little bit dated, but we know what it does immediately. We know how to interact with it. The closed spout, we know exactly where that water is going to come out. The fact that it suggests a solidity that perhaps is missing from more contemporary tap designs. It has a traditional look, so will fit in with a lot of older types of bathtubs, will fit in with more traditional settings without standing out. This chair, what's familiar about it? It's got 4 legs, it's got a back, it's got this kind of straight up and down, squarish, blocky look to it. The base is wood, there's a flat fabric seat. We know how to interact with this chair. From a semiotic point of view, this is very chair. It's definitely not a table. It's definitely not a vase. This is a chair. And so it will fit in with a traditional setting. We know how to interact with it. Nothing is surprising, and yet nothing is offensive, because that's another thing. When you try something new, you risk alienating your audience, you risk offending them. This is a pretty safe design that really isn't going to offend anyone, even if it isn't going to inspire them. And now we look at this more traditional shoe rack. So we've got the old wooden shelves. You rest your shoes on. Again, nothing flashy, nothing that stands out, but we know how to use it. And that's where a lot of familiarity comes from. It's the functionality. It's knowing what those interactions are. So we've seen the different elements of what's good about familiarity, what's good about novelty. So why is this important to designers, and what do we know about it from research? There is an effect called the mere exposure effect, and it has been documented and tested many times in psychology. And it means that the more often you see something, the more you prefer it. It's also called the familiarity principle, and it's been tested with faces, Chinese characters, paintings, geometric figures, many objects. And they have shown repeatedly, if you see something over and over and over and over again, it becomes familiar to you and you actually start liking it more. It's a fundamental tenet of advertising. It's why they repeat things over and over. It's why they saturate you with the image of the product within the media, so that you become familiar with it, you start to like it, and you might pick that product off the shelf in preference to one of its competitors you haven't seen that often. So when we talk about familiarity, the term they use for that is prototypicality. So does it stand for a genre? It doesn't have to be the identical design each time. It can just be very similar. And the similarity between these items in a particular genre create that prototypicality. So if we start thinking about how this applies to websites, have a think about the different websites you've visited. Travel websites, a lot of them look very similar. Online shops, very similar, often a very white background, and they use cards or little squares to show the images of the products with the price underneath. Photography websites, a lot of those are scrolling websites with photographs that fill the entire page. Originality is attractive in certain genres and yet not others. There are certain genres that are more likely to push the envelope. Now, originality attracts attention. It creates a certain expectation in the viewer. It's offbeat, it's unexpected, unique, it's fun, it's experimental. And so for that reason, certain genres have a preference towards it. Now, design folios, some of those can be very minimalist and very predictable, but there are others where the designers want to show their personality, want to show what they are like as a designer, and they deliberately take it to that other level where it is very novel. Entertainment websites, so have a look at some movie websites or games or animations. They're quite happy to show some originality to create their own feeling of branding. Food or beverage brand websites can sometimes be this way. Lollies, soft drink, those sort of things. Things that want to have a youthful, fun look often will try to push the envelope. But ironically, if you have a look at enough of them, a lot of them try and push the envelope in the same way. And then that's how this feeling of familiarity comes about. So when you are designing a website, you need to deliberately strike a balance between novelty and familiarity. All effective website designs balance these two factors. Now, some will be more familiar, others will be more novel, but there's always got to be that element of familiarity in there so people know how to interact with it. But there's always got to be that novelty in there so that you are not just copying another website with absolutely no new features. So here's an example from research where 34 industrial design students were asked to sketch what first came to mind when someone mentioned the word chair. So these are people who are familiar with the design of chairs. So you can see on the left, we've got some typical designs of chairs, and then to the bottom right, you can see the atypical designs. Then the participants were shown pictures of 88 chairs and asked to group them according to the given adjectives: ugly, beautiful, typical, and unique. And the average results were plotted on a graph. And you can see that the graph shows there is a sweet spot where the design is not too typical and not too unique, and that gives the highest average rating for being beautiful. So why do we like typicality? You know, if novel things attract our attention, why aren't they the things that we are drawn to all the time? Why do we want some things to be familiar? We can recognize what it is really, really quickly. It doesn't challenge our opinions, so it doesn't offend us. But most importantly, we know how to use it. This is a heat map analysis of a typical website design. So people typically look across the top from left to right if they're English speakers, because that's how we read, and then they look down the side to the left, and then they start looking at the other places of the website. So most websites will put the navigation either across the top or to the left, because that's where people are going to be looking, that's where people are going to find them. Now, of course, this creates a self-repeating cycle, because the more websites that put their navigation across the top or to the left side reinforces this unwritten rule of how you design a website. Take note of the next slide. This is a heat map showing scrolling, where users spend most of their time scrolling down a long website. So you can see that most of the time is spent at the top of the website, what we call above the fold. That term coming from the old newspaper trade, where when you put the broadsheet or even the tabloid newspaper for sale, often it's folded in half. And so the reader, the person buying the newspaper, will only see what is quite literally above the fold, so that they know what the most important stories of the day are. And we still use that terminology in web design. We say above the fold. That is the part of the web page that loads first, that we don't have to scroll to see. And you can see here that it is the place that people spend most of their time on. So it's the place that you want to put the most important information. If you were to put it right down the bottom, yes, that would be surprising, that would be unusual, but most of your viewers would not actually get to it. So a site feature can be novel when it's first used. So an example, of course, are those long scrolling websites. When I first started designing websites, you would not design a website like that. It would be pointless, because back in those days, bandwidth was a lot more expensive and a lot harder to come by. And so you wanted a website that would load really, really quickly with just enough information for what the user wanted. Now, as bandwidth became cheaper and more available, especially with mobile devices where it's easier to scroll than click through links, these long sites became much, much more popular. Infinite scrolling websites, we call them. So they were novel at first, and they really were only used by cutting-edge websites that wanted to push the envelope with design. Now, as it became more and more common for designers to use this, people would see it more often. It becomes familiar and more liked, so the mere exposure effect. So over time, these novel things become familiar, and to make things novel, you have to try new things again. And so that's how design progresses over time. So what does this mean for your website design? Have a look first at what familiarity, what prototypicality is in your particular genre. You will pick a topic in your first week that you are going to design a website for. You need to know what your target audience is looking for and expecting. So they'll immediately like something that is familiar. They will immediately know how to use a familiar looking website. And for this reason, you need to do your visual research. You need to do your competitor analysis and see what's being done in your genre of websites. However, that's not to say you need to copy what everyone else is doing verbatim. You need to attract enough novelty to attract attention, to provide your own brand so that people know your website and your business as distinct from the other ones that already exist. In some genres, you'll find there's a lot of novelty needed. In other genres, if you're doing a web design for a bank, for instance, you don't want that much novelty because you want people to trust you. You want the tradition, you want the familiarity. The important thing is it must serve the user needs and the site goals. So have a look through your competitive analysis to see how much novelty is acceptable, how much novelty is expected in your genre, and use that to influence your website design. The worst designs I've ever seen have been the ones that try for absolute originality, so it looks like no other website out there. There's a good reason it would look like no other website out there. It's because it was making all the mistakes that no other websites wanted to make. At the same time, the ones that just look like they've copied another website with no originality at all, they're pretty boring to look at. So you really need to weigh up what you need to do. Start with the base of what is familiar. Find out what is being done by other designers. Do really, really careful research, and then start adding those lovely novel elements that will create interest, that will create joy in your viewer. Remember, there's a saying, which is, if you steal from one source, it's plagiarism. If you steal from many, it's research. So go out and research and have fun finding out what sort of designs are done in this topic area that you've chosen.